Welcome, everyone, to Our Whole Lives Taking Flight. We're delighted that you are with us today. My name is the Reverend Amy Johnson, and I serve as the Minister for Sexuality, Education, and Justice in the United Church of Christ. And we are super excited to have with us today author Jamie Bruesehoff, who wrote this amazing book, Raising Kids Beyond the Binary. But before we dive into that, we also have my all sister in all things. Melanie, introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here. I'm in Portland, Oregon, instead of my usual New Jersey. And I am the UUA's OWL program manager. And I'm delighted to pass the mic to Jamie.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be with you all. I am Jamie Bruesehoff. I am based in New Jersey. I am an LGBTQ plus advocate and author, and the parent of three wonderful children, including a 17-year-old transgender daughter who kind of set me into this work. I come out of a ELCA, a Lutheran background, and this book really came out of my desire to have a resource for people who care about transgender and non-binary and gender diverse young people from the perspective of a Christian faith context, knowing that too often faith is a barrier to loving the person in front of you when it should be the opposite. So it is not exclusively for people of faith, but it does come from that lens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'd like to encourage our UU or secular listeners that while Jamie comes to us from a Christian perspective, her book is a wonderful resource for parents, teachers, OWL facilitators, and people of any faith background or no faith background. It is truly a message of empowerment and support and love that should resonate with everybody today.
I'm just so thrilled that you're here with us, Jamie. I want to say I was reading your book and I was saying this earlier, like you can see like I dog-eared like every other page because it's just so it's so accessible. It has so many just snippets and depth of wisdom in what you're writing. And I know we're going to jump into a whole bunch of things around that, but I want to start with a question that my friend and Melanie and our also mutual friend and colleague, UU Pastor Tandy Rogers, asks a lot, which is, what is your holy why about doing this work?
I love that question. What a beautiful way to start the conversation. And I would say at the simplest or at the most personal, my holy why is my daughter. My 17-year-old daughter, Rebecca, is transgender. And so when she was born, we thought she was a boy, but she deeply knows herself to be a girl. And she socially transitioned when she was 8 years old. And it was the experience of walking alongside her and coming to understand her identity alongside her, and then kind of equipping the people around us, starting with our family, our extended family, our community. I'm married to a Lutheran pastor, and so our church community and the school, and eventually those circles of advocacy and education just got wider and wider until suddenly this became what I do for a living, which was never the plan. But I think seeing the way that her stepping into the fullness of her identity not only just had her joy explode, and the way it's impacted everyone around her. You know, I think when we show up fully as ourselves, we make room for other people to do the same, and we have seen that so intimately with our daughter, and so she's taught us so much. And so I want to work to create room so more kids and adults get to fully be themselves. And so whether they're trans or non-binary or gender expansive or not, you know, I've learned more about what it means to fully be myself because of doing this work. And so I think that's my holy why.
Yeah.
I loved the anecdote in your book about her telling your son about who she was at that young age. And he's like, okay, we just didn't know.
Yes. Yeah, no, I loved it so much. He was really like, "Oh, you're a girl. I just didn't know. I'll do that. I'll call you that now." And it was amazing.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. And you do a lot of speaking engagements inside and outside the Lutheran Church. And what do you find is like one of the most common things people are asking you when you're out and about in the world doing this work?
Yeah, this is a great question. I feel like it somewhat depends depending on audience. I do lots of work in secular and sacred spaces, but I think overwhelmingly, um, the question I get the most is how to deal with the tough stuff, how to deal with people who don't get it, how to deal with people that cause harm, how to deal with the state of the world today. I think the most common question is just like, how do you do it, and stay hopeful. And I think that's really real in this moment. I think most of us are probably asking that question: how do we navigate the world today and stay hopeful when there is so much hard stuff? And I think my answer to that is young people. Young people give me a lot of hope. My children for sure, but all the young people I get to work with. And one of the things that as parents of transgender children, we often say when we're teaching people that have never met a transgender person to their knowledge about our kids, we say, you know, our kids are just like other kids. We say it all the time. And yet also they're extraordinary. They're not just like other kids, like trans and non-binary and gender expansive people of all ages, just who they have to be in ways they shouldn't have to be, their resilience and all of that, and we can talk about, but also just the fullness of who they are and the way they teach us what it means to love, what it means to take up space, the way they shine. And so I think that's where I get a lot of my hope to keep going. And knowing that this work has been going on for a long time, long before I was a part of it, and will continue after, and doing this work in community and learning from those around us.
Yeah, and that's so humbling, isn't it? That it's been going on, and that people who are not part of the made up, I will say, gender binary, is, you know, they've been around forever. They've been around forever. They're in the Bible. They're, you know, they've been around since biblical times and before. And somehow the narrative, especially I think the like prevailing sort of Christian narrative that's taking over in you know, media and stuff, is that that's not true, and it's just false. It's just false.
Mhm.
So and just have that humbling thing of, here we are stepping into this, here I am in my lifetime stepping into this advocacy work and this love work, total love work, and sacred human work, right? And knowing that there have been so many people who have come before us and that we're still here. That's a place where I can get into that how do I keep hope place, definitely sometimes. Yeah.
I appreciated in your book, Jamie, that you mentioned the advocates, not the trans people and allies who you acknowledge in your book as being groundbreaking in terms of paving the way for where the work that you're doing now and the work that your daughter is doing now. And I think that that's so important that we lift up and honor the not only the individuals who were protecting their own lives, but those who literally put their lives on the line for others like them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my daughter gets to live the life she does because of the work that has been done in all of those people that have come before her, and in the trans people that have poured themselves into me, that have taught me. I mean, like, it is the most humbling and greatest gift of my life to the way the trans community has taught me how to be a better mom to my kid, and taught me how to be a better human being. And especially as someone, while I certainly don't feel comfortable in the binary, I am a cisgender woman writing this book and talking about raising kids beyond the binary. It was so important to me that it be informed by and center the voices of trans people. And so there's a foreword from Senator Sarah McBride, who is an incredible trans woman, and my daughter Rebecca writes the afterword and explains that, you know, everything I've shared, I share with her permission, and that her voice really determines how we do this work and where we take this story.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so important. We were talking about that before we came on the webinar, in the pre-time, about how amazing it is that sometimes youth are more savvy than the grown-ups in their lives about what to share and how to share it in a public setting. So, so we're grateful for all the ways that we learn. You know, you're talking about the role models, and I know that Melanie had brought up earlier that you talk about the difference between possibility models and role models in your book. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I love the term possibility models. I mentioned hope, and the possibility models are such a source of hope. I think about the trans people that have come before my daughter and that have shown what it looks like to take up space and be themselves in a world that too often isn't built for them, certainly wasn't built for them, and still isn't. And I love the phrase possibility model instead of role model, because it's not about teaching someone exactly how to play a role or how to take up a specific space in society, but instead showing young people what's possible. And so whether that's, a trans senator like Sarah McBride, or we see folks in media representation, Laverne Cox and the groundbreaking representation she has, or Raquel Willis in journalism, and so many others. And so that this shows young people not what they have to be, but that all of the things are possible for them.
Yeah.
I think that one of the, I remember, when I've heard people say, oh, well, he does a good job of passing, or she, you'd never know. And I think when I think of possibilities, I'm like there's a possibility that you get to express yourself however you want. And there shouldn't be a marker of, oh, well, they pass, so they're doing trans right. And I think in a way that the folks who come out as non-binary have helped that, because now we know there are so many people, so many ways to just be human, express who we are, outside of whatever labels, and hopefully outside of whatever judgments people are placing on how well we do who we are.
Yeah.
And we all, sorry.
Oh, you go ahead.
We,
Go ahead.
we all benefit from that. When we start to break down these boxes of what it means to be a man or a woman or a human in society, I know I am freer to show up fully as myself. And cisgender men and cisgender women are able to loosen the pressures to show up in this very prescribed and specific and narrow way of what it means to be ourselves in the world. And that's just good for everyone. And so we all owe a debt of gratitude to the trailblazing that this community has and continues to do.
Yeah, I agree. And I was just going to say in a similar vein that I think sometimes when we talk about people for whom this information seems new or uncomfortable, I have found, and I think there isn't necessarily a certain demographic for who this is true. I think it's just people for whom this hasn't been something that they've needed to be aware of in their lives. But sometimes people will find it easier to understand someone who is trans, who is going from like this one binary box to this other binary box, rather than somebody who is non-binary and is like, there is not a box for me. And so I think that it's important for us to think about how we are getting our information and who we are asking to educate us. And you talk in your book a little bit about different types of curiosity. You talk about difference between hospitable curiosity and lurid curiosity. And I'd love if you'd take a few minutes and talk to us about that today.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's this idea that curiosity kind of exists on a spectrum, with hospitable curiosity on one end and lurid curiosity on the other. And hospitable curiosity is curiosity that helps us show up in community with one another. It helps us build a relationship of mutual trust and respect. It helps us know what other people need to be known and seen and cared for. In short, it's curiosity that serves others. Lurid curiosity, on the other hand, is why reality TV exists. It's why we all slow down on the highway when there's an accident on the side of the road, even if emergency personnel is already there and we have no plan or intention to help. We just want to know what happened. And that's human nature. Like, we don't need to add shame to that or anything, but that's curiosity that serves us instead of others. And so it's important, maybe you've heard the phrase, there are no bad questions. There are sometimes bad questions, or maybe they're questions that are just asked in the wrong place of the wrong person. And so asking people about the details of their bodies or what they do with them in intimate relationships is never hospitable. And understanding like why our ask is coming from this, or why we want to know it. And sometimes it's that lurid curiosity, or that general curiosity, like maybe I've never met a transgender person to my knowledge that I was aware of, and I just want to know, like, what does it mean? What does a medical transition look like, for instance? That's a valid thing you might want to learn about. And I say with a lot of caution, like, Google can be your friend as long as you check your sources really well. Books are good, documentaries are good, things like that. But you don't ask the human being in front of you, because it's not their responsibility to educate you about all of the intimate details of their lives and what makes them them and how they navigate the world, in the same way that you wouldn't want to do that for someone else.
I'm just remembering when I taught an undergraduate human sexuality course, and whenever we got to the lesson on gender, somebody would say, well, I would never date a transgender person. I said, how do you know? How do you know? And they said, well, they should tell you up front. And I'm like, really? Because when I was dating, there was never a point at which I felt compelled to talk about my genitals. It didn't come up on the first date. It didn't come up before a first date. So why does anybody owe you that information? Go on a couple dates, and if a relationship is going to form, sure, then you're going to share personal information about each other. But this idea that a trans person owes anybody information about their medical decisions, about their bodies, even about their transition, let's just do away with that expectation.
Yeah, it objectifies people, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
And another thing that that I think is important, a distinction, and especially as people, like I identify as a cisgender heterosexual person, right? And so I have a lot of different privilege. So the difference between being uncomfortable and being unsafe, those are two very, very different things. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, it's tricky. We throw those words around, I think sometimes without being intentional about what the situation is. And I think like so often we hear talking about like body parts, like you were saying, is like people are obsessed with bodies and body parts. And one of the examples that I love to use to kind of explain uncomfortable and unsafe is something that people are also obsessed with, is bathrooms. People get really riled up about bathrooms, and that relates to this body part thing. And so we might hear someone say, like, if we have a situation and a cisgender girl is uncomfortable using a bathroom with a transgender girl, or maybe it's a school setting, and this cisgender girl has known this child for a very long time and thought they were a boy, and only recently discovered that they know themselves to be a girl, and is really uncomfortable. That cisgender girl is uncomfortable. The transgender girl in this situation is potentially unsafe, or is at most risk of being unsafe, because we know when we look at statistics around safety in gender segregated spaces, that trans and non-binary and LGBTQ plus people as a whole are disproportionately at risk for harassment, intimidation, bullying, and assault in bathrooms and other gender segregated spaces. And we know that the implications to things like depression, anxiety, and suicidality, and mental health and well-being when a transgender person is not given access to facilities that align with who they are dire. And so in that situation where we might have a cisgender girl who feels uncomfortable, we can care both about the person who is uncomfortable and the person who is unsafe, but we're not going to make someone unsafe in the interest of making someone else more comfortable. So we would never say to the transgender girl, you have to go use a different space because the cisgender person is uncomfortable. Instead, we might talk with the cisgender person and say, hey, what do you need? What would help you navigate this discomfort? New experiences can be uncomfortable. And maybe that girl just needs some time and some understanding and some education. Maybe she needs access to a different space because that would be what would feel best for her. But we're not going to make someone unsafe to make her more comfortable. On the flip side, I think sometimes when we're talking about inclusion, people can become really dogmatic and cause a lot of shame to people that are uncomfortable or have concerns. And when we go to that shaming place of saying, like, if we were to say to this cisgender girl who's uncomfortable, like, you are a bad person for not being completely okay and being excited to use this bathroom with this child that you thought was a boy for most of your life, then we are making that girl unsafe, because shame has a really real impact on our mental health and well-being. And so we can care about everyone in a situation, and we can encourage people to lean into discomfort in ways that are generative and that result in growth, but we don't want to push anyone into an unsafe space, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I was thinking about, so I knew somebody who said his gender expression, he transitioned from assigned female at birth to male, and said he started dressing in a more masculine way than he was ready to dress in for safety, so that he could use the men's room and not, feel uncomfortable, and he would have been unsafe, and that's a shame. It reminded me of when you were talking about your daughter wearing all this pink stuff, because that was her language. That's what she knew, and I'm mindful of how many people are expressing themselves in a way that maybe aren't authentic, but they're trying to make themselves safe. And wouldn't it be lovely if we did care about everybody's comfort and acknowledging the discomfort equally to protect the people who need it.
Yeah, and I'm mindful that that's a real live issue right now, particularly around bathrooms, particularly around schools, and even just receiving care for who you are, medical care for people in so many states. I know there are many of the laws that are not passing, but there are always a continual stream of more legislation that's coming through. Last year, there were over 500 laws that were proposed, and I believe the statistic is something like 100 passed. And so we don't want to, I think, as anybody who's on here who's an Our Whole Lives facilitator and Our Whole Lives trainer in particular, we definitely, that is such good, I think, information for us, that we make sure that we are not prioritizing or centering someone's discomfort over another person's safety, and to have that distinction and to be aware, and also that we're not shaming someone, because that does tip things over into, it can tip over into definitely emotional unsafety and other unsafety, because like you said, shame is not safe. And yet we live in a world where there is a lot of centering of discomfort over safety. And I mean, how do you respond to that? I know you talked about hope and all those kind of things, but are there specific tips you would have for anyone to navigate those conversations or to deal with that in their work or their life?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard. I think what we have to understand is the sheer amount of misinformation that's out there right now. There are so many good and kind people who want to learn, who are hearing information that concern them and that are leading them to conclusions. So, I mean, we hear this around, you mentioned medical care. We've seen half of the states in this country have banned gender affirming care for young people, which is devastating. And some of the misconceptions behind that are that like surgeries are being done on young children, and that's simply not the case. But if I had no other frame of reference and someone said that people are doing gender affirming surgeries on 5-year-olds, I would be concerned. I would say, oh, that doesn't sound right. Yeah, we should make sure that doesn't happen. And so because people don't have a good frame of reference, they're leading to a conclusion and then building an entire understanding of the world around that. And so I think education is key, and being willing to like re-level set the facts and say, okay, well, where are we? What is the concern? Often I think when we're talking about any given situation, like if it's housing, if it's bathrooms, if it's curriculum, whatever it is, like asking, even if it's another parent who is, say, you know, really concerned about their child and what they're experiencing, I kind of love to just say, if you have the capacity and you're in a position to do so, encourage them to tell you more. They come to you with a concern, and maybe it's full of big language and talking points you might hear on the media and whatever else, and you say, okay, tell me more. Like, what are you worried about? And really listening and taking some time, and after a few tell me mores, you may eventually get to something that makes a lot of sense. I do a lot of work with people who work with youth in youth groups or in summer camps, and so sometimes parents will call and be like, well, I'm just really concerned, you know, there can't be a trans kid in my kid's cabin, and they'll go on and on, and after so many tell me mores, a parent may go, well, I just don't want my daughter to have to see a boy's genitals in her cabin. Oh my goodness. Well, guess what? I don't want any of our campers to see anyone's genitals. That is a value that we have at camp. And these are the things that we do to make sure that happens. These are our expectations of privacy. These are our safety protocols. These are this. And so if you can get to that shared common value, if we can get to the kind of fear underneath all of the hyperbole, we can say, oh my gosh, that's really important to me too. I want to make sure your child is safe. I want to make sure that that discomfort can be generative, and that someone can be supported in that discomfort, and not like left alone to feel really vulnerable. And so if we can get to that shared common ground, that's when we get to build from. Then we have a foundation.
Yeah, and I think that's so important with things like camp and youth programming that goes overnight, to really center the privacy that I know there's sometimes a prevailing sort of belief, like it's sort of a rite of passage that you change in front of everybody else or whatever. But there's so many reasons why privacy is important, right? There's just so many reasons why it is at any age. And so to be able to create space and to create procedures where people can have enough privacy to be safe, right? It doesn't have to be, you know, everybody has their own private bedroom and private bathroom, right? But that there's enough privacy in whatever procedures and policies that we put in place that allow people to have enough privacy to be safe. That takes care of a lot of the safety issues. And again, then the discomfort is that, well, this isn't the way we've always done it. And that's always a discomfort place, right?
The processing that you went through is, we actually have an activity like that in OWL for older adults called the Rule of Three. And it's about having someone state a concern that they have, and then someone say, okay, well, let's say that you didn't have that concern. What would happen? And then, so you take it through 3 levels. So if anybody listening has a copy of OWL for older adults, we use that in the workshop on loss. And we also use the same, modify it for the workshop on dating, but that would be the framework for the questioning series that you're talking about.
I love that.
Thank you. Yeah. And it's very powerful. It's a powerful exercise. I want to also circle back a little bit, because you talked about like, you know, we're not doing surgeries on really young kids, except for when we are, because of intersex conditions, right? And because there's still, even though it's best practice not to do surgery on an infant, there are still times when that is happening, right? And you talk a little bit about some of the, I'm going to let you talk about it from how you have it in your book. There are many ways to talk about it, but I thought your way was lovely. So
yeah, absolutely. it's interesting in this whole conversation about us doing surgeries on young children, the bills that are being passed are actually often have a carve out to allow surgeries on intersex or babies with intersex traits to still happen. And so it's the idea that when a baby is born that has an intersex trait, so some sort of trait that doesn't fit into what is kind of typically expected for female or male bodies or biology, or there's a variety of language to use, and that may be internal reproductive organs, external genitalia, or related to genetics and chromosomes, but we really only know it at birth if it's related to external genitalia. And so it used to be commonplace to perform surgery on these babies to have them fit into our expectations of what a body should look like. And sometimes, in some situations, surgery is medically necessary in order for their parts to function, and that makes a lot of sense. But overwhelmingly, it's usually not necessary. And so there's been a lot of advocacy from people in the intersex community to say, around bodily autonomy, to say, we don't want to be forced into a box. Our bodies should not be cut up or performed operations on that aren't necessary without our consent. And so listening to that community and learning from them has certainly taught me a lot, and I continue to listen to and learn from them. But it's this idea that we have to force people into this binary, whether it's about bodies or it's behaviors, it's all related. And often we hear from intersex adults that actually discover later, perhaps they had surgery done on them when they were infants and never knew they had an intersex trait, or this was a part of their medical history, and find out later as adults, and the amount of betrayal or understanding why things never quite fit or why things didn't make sense. And that kind of importance of so much bodily autonomy is such a thread through all of these conversations. And so I appreciate that in how it informs the way we talk about all young people and all kinds of bodies and all kinds of situations.
Well,
Yeah, and when we
also
talk
there's,
about this, oh, go ahead, Melanie.
well, I was going to say, there are teenagers who have breasts and want them enlarged, or who want them reduced. There are people who get, medical treatment because their weight isn't what they want their weight to be. There are people who have rhinoplasties because their noses aren't what they want them to be. People going to tanning salons, because their skin isn't the color they want it to be, right? And there isn't an outcry about all that. It's specific to, well, your genitals need to look a certain way, or they have to match who your birth, it's so discriminatory that it's people neglect to think about the other situations where people are changing their bodies. Nobody's complaining. Nobody's getting involved. There are cancer treatments that affect people's ability to procreate later on. Nobody's saying don't get your kid treated for cancer. It's just this particular issue of genitalia and gender boxes that seems to just get everybody riled up.
Yeah, and
well, and so many of the sorry, so many of the examples you just said are actually about people conforming more to society's expectations. And so it's interesting to note that, of course, we don't have a problem if you want to do all of these medical procedures so you can fit more into the box that we expect for you, opposed to being more fully yourself. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that fits right in. That's a great segue into what I was going to say, which is that there's this, well, first of all, the term biological sex has been weaponized a lot, but that there's this false information that is the truth. There is this or that, and that is absolutely not true. And as you just spoke, and Melanie and I have intersex colleagues and people that we know, and they're like, you're erasing my biology, right? If you say there's only male biology or female biology, like you're erasing my actual biological sex, right? And many times performing what amounts to genital mutilation on infants. And so I think, I know I'm using strong language, but I think it's really important for us to think about that and to be aware of those pieces. And then also like what you were both talking about other surgeries and procedures that people have in order, because the pressure is so strong, especially in this culture, to conform not only to a binary, but to specific traits in each of those binaries. Because there's also, you know, procedures for people to have, or medication that people take to have bigger muscles, or to have a larger penis, or other things like that. So, so it's really quite an amazing thing when you tease it apart. And I love that part about, like, you know, tell me more, and to think about, again, what is unsafe versus uncomfortable. Because I think when we think about the intersex infants with intersex traits or intersex conditions, and we think about that in terms of safety, I think people are so uncomfortable that they are taking an action that they think will make their child safe, and in actuality may end up doing just the opposite. So,
Well, and isn't reversible. When we talk about puberty blockers, that's reversible, right? And that goes back to your point, Jamie, about the misinformation that's out there. That, you know, oh, if we delay menstruation, they're never gonna, you know, they're never gonna be able to have it, or what, you know, and like, okay, but it's perfectly normal for people maybe who aren't trans, but who maybe they just don't get their period till they're 17. That's not considered a problem. So this range of difference, this continuum of, you know, here to here to off the charts, wherever. One of the things that Amy and I have been striving to do every time that we update OWL or our trainings is to get people to understand that, you know, yeah, for some people, they're on a continuum from here to here. And for other people, they're here to here. And for other people, they're not on the continuum. It's just not applicable to them. So I appreciate that while your book is about trans kids or youth, it leaves space for other people holding other identities and other biological realities to be supported by their parents and their caregivers and their teachers in their lives. So I really appreciated that about your book.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the idea of moving away from that continuum from here to here and understanding there's more depth. You know, I say at some point in the book that we have to throw away kind of all of these continuums that situate everything between these ends that are the norms around which we define ourselves. And maybe it's a three-dimensional sphere, or it's a blob, or whatever else it may be, but things are just not so linear and neat. And that's so often the work we're doing in all of these conversations, creating space for us all to show up fully as ourselves in all of our diversity, and know that that's a good thing.
So I thought this was a good time to start talking a little bit about that in terms of some of the scripture, and asking people to hang in there with us, because I think this is helpful for you whether or not you use the Bible as your sacred text. And then there's a question in the Q&A that popped up right when I was thinking that, just about this very issue, about like the God created them that way kind of thing. So you do have a chapter where you go into several different scriptures, and some that are used more than others and more commonly to do that. And one of them is the scripture about God made them, and male and female God made them. And I love, you have some consultants that you've worked with, and some ways that people have countered that. And I'm just wondering, is it all right if I just read a little bit of what
Yeah.
Asher O'Callaghan has said? So
Mhm.
Jamie has this in the book under the chapter Who God Made Me to Be. So hopefully this will be a helpful for the person with the question. So Asher says, well, in the beginning, God created day and night, but have you ever seen a sunset? Well, trans and non-binary people are kind of like that. Gorgeous, full of hundreds of shades of color you can't see in plain daylight or during the night. In the beginning, God created land and sea, but have you ever seen a beach? Well, trans and non-binary people are kind of like that. Beautiful, a balanced oasis that's not quite like an ocean and not quite like the land. In the beginning, God created birds of the air and fish of the sea, but have you ever seen a flying fish, or a duck, or a puffin that swims and flies, spending lots of time in the water and on the land? Well, trans and non-binary people are kind of like that, full of life, a creative combination of characteristics that blows people's minds. In the beginning, God also created male and female. In God's own image, God created them. So in the same way that God created realities in between, outside of, and beyond night and day, land and sea, or fish and birds, so God also created people with genders beyond male and female. Trans and non-binary and agender and intersex, God created us. All different sorts of people for all different sorts of relationships, created from love, to love, and be loved. In God's image, we live. I just,
What
now,
a beautiful poem.
isn't that just gorgeous?
Mm.
I don't know that you're going to convince anyone who deeply believes otherwise. However, I think that having that perspective deeply in our own hearts can help us remember and own our own belief, if it is our own belief, that we are created in love, to love, and as beloved, always as we are.
And that's imagery that I think even non-theists could understand. Because yeah, the midway points and the all containing points. It's a beautiful poem. I hope, Amy, I hope that that we can put the name of that poem at least and the author in the
Yeah, I don't know that it's a
letter.
poem, but it's words that Asher has written. Yeah.
Yeah, Pastor Asher O'Callahan originally posted it on his Facebook page and gave me permission to include it in the book. And it's beautiful. I think what I love as someone who connects deeply to nature as a place where I find connection to the sacred, connection to God, connection to my creator, whatever language you want to use. I love the natural world, and that these are some of the most beautiful times of the day and the most beautiful places on earth, and to be able to compare those to the beauty of the variety of human beings that make up our world is just so
Yeah.
beautiful.
You know,
Yeah,
it's funny, Jamie, because it's like when people will say, well, you don't see gays in nature. Well, yeah, you do. There's like 150 species that have, you know, biologically similar partners.
yeah, because
And
science, yeah. I also just
Because
want to mention,
science.
I also want to mention that you mentioned Reverend M.J. Kaiser, and I know they do a lot of work on the Enfleshed site. So if you are someone who wants worship resources or liturgy, or to read some more things that are really outside of really any binaries about race and about liberation and LGBTQIA issues, I would highly recommend the Enfleshed site.
and that's Enfleshed, right?
And yeah, maybe Laura, I'm gonna lean on our tech person that didn't know I was gonna mention that site. Thank you, Laura. The other one, Laura's a pastor too, so I know that she is that. I also wanted to say there's another scripture in Corinthians, right, about bodies, and you talk in your book about that. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 12, and you talk about like we can't just say, oh, you're not what I thought, so I don't love you, right? And also the part about like if one piece of our body of Christ is suffering, we're all suffering. Similar, liberation theology, no one's free until we're all free. If any one of us isn't free, then none of us are free, those kind of things. So can you speak a little bit more to that and how that maybe has helped you in working with some folks?
Yeah, absolutely. The body of Christ, the imagery in that text is so beautiful, and the idea that we need all of these parts of the body, and the language is like the eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you, or the hand can't say to the eye or the ear, where would the hearing be, and so on. And the idea that we need all of these parts of the body, and that we're all very different, but we're all part of the same body. And when one part of us hurts, we all hurt. And when one of us rejoices, we all rejoice. And I think it can be tempting to want to put people into like boxes. Like we'll put the trans people will be the hand and the women will be the foot. And we have to understand that with the idea of intersectionality and the idea that we have many identities that exist, that we're not, a hand is not only one piece, because we know from the disability community that you can be a whole person without a hand or an arm and all of those things. And so when we're missing a part of the body of Christ, when we're missing trans people in our communities, we're missing something much more than a hand per se. We're missing an integral piece of every part of our body. And so what I love about the body of Christ imagery is that to be whole, we need all of us. And so when we talk about the work of inclusion in our communities, in our faith spaces, in our schools, and whatever it looks like, in order for us to experience wholeness, we need all kinds of people there. And that when one of us hurts, we all hurt with them. And it ties really closely into the idea of, we talk about being created in the image of God, and that as people that have been created in the image of God, we know that if that's true, then trans people are created in the image of God, and queer people are created in the image of God, and bisexual people are created in the image of God. And so God is all of those things. And so that means that if I'm not in relationship with trans people or non-binary people or queer people, then I'm missing out on part of who God is. And so we don't do this work of inclusion to, check a box or to feel good about ourselves, but we do it because we are more whole and we learn more about the God who created all of us in being in relationship with other human beings. And you could sub out lots of that language to make it more universal beyond just a Christian framework, but that's kind of the lens that I talk about it in, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think I just preached to a UU congregation that is getting new space. They kind of had I'm thinking of that Pointer Sisters song, I got a new attitude. They want to have more people of different races and more people of different ages and, all kinds of different people. And so I was saying, so what are you going to change to make that happen? Because if you just take who you are and move it into a new space, that's not opening the doors and creating welcome for all the possibilities and all the people that you say you want to come through the doors, because there's no room for them. Whatever you're doing now isn't welcoming. So you've got to really do some self-examining to figure out why are these people not entering our doors? What is it that we are doing that is giving the message that they would not be welcome here? There is a question in the chat that I think is pertinent to what you just said. It was, what is your recommendation for responding to those who don't believe that one's identity does not have to align with one's genitalia, particularly when God didn't create them that way?
Yeah, and I was gonna just jump in on that a little bit, and I'd love to hear what you have to say as well, Jamie. But I think that, this idea of God didn't create people the way they are. Well, God created everybody who they were and how they're meant to be. And you talk about this in your book too, right? It's society that has messed with that. So there are people who are born with a vulva who identify as men. My deep belief is God doesn't have a problem with that. It's society that has a problem with that. And society that's prescribing that if you have a vulva, you have to wear dresses and you have to wear your hair long and you have to paint your nails and you have to have big breasts and all that kind of stuff, as opposed to us just including people how they are. And so that's what causes the dissonance and the dysphoria. It's not God, y'all. It's us. It's us.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. We hear all the time the phrase God doesn't make mistakes used as a weapon against this community, when I think it's actually the most beautiful affirmation. God doesn't make mistakes. My kid was created to be exactly who she knows herself to be. And that's not some failure or mistake or less than. It is the beautiful wholeness of who she is. God made her trans because being trans is good. And that's when we have to move away from all these preconceived notions about somehow it being less than, or something that needs to be corrected. Now, granted, then we talk about what it looks like to have gender affirming care, and that path looks different for everyone, but it's also the same way in that, you know, sometimes people need glasses, and we don't think that goes against how God created us to be. And so there's such possibility. I think that type of thinking that creates the God doesn't make mistakes in a negative way is just putting God into a really tiny box. It's
Mhm.
saying that God is so much smaller, when I really think that that's a God of our own making. I believe in a God that is much bigger and much broader and is capable of more than I can even imagine. And I learn about that God in relationship with people that go beyond my preconceived notions of what I thought about the world.
You know,
Yeah,
that
I mean, like, I wouldn't need glasses if everything was in the world was created in a way where I could see it, you know, like, so that's
Exactly.
us, you know, there's so many things that we do as humans that we just kind of take for granted because we're our culture is very ableist. It's very
Mhm.
binary. It's very supremacy oriented, but we just swim in that water all the time that we think that's normal. When it, as you said earlier, when we break that open, then we all get to be more whole.
you know,
Yeah, when we talk about, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say that you start one of your chapters with the sad statistics about what happens when a society is not accepting of trans folks, and the suicidal ideation. And I really like the way that you reframed it as it's not that being trans makes people mentally ill. It's that society's attitudes towards gender identities that don't match the way society says they have to, that unwelcoming and unsafety is what creates the stress and the depression that can lead to the suicide ideation and actuality of suicide.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see that play out when we look at the statistics on the flip side, when we look at the impact of support and affirmation and access to affirming spaces. Those rates of anxiety and depression and suicidality drop significantly because the problem isn't inherent in the person, it's in the space around us. And so support and affirmation save lives, full stop. And so we know, like, that's the proof point that bears out. That trans and non-binary people do not struggle because there's something wrong with them. They struggle because of what they face in society.
Yeah. Oh, this is just such a rich conversation. I just wish we could keep going forever.
I wanted to mention that we have had other Owl Taking Flight webinars related to this topic, some of which are specific to what folks in the UCC and the UUA and other advocacy groups are doing to support the trans community. And so those, you can find those on the UCC YouTube playlist and also on the UUA OWL facilitator resources page. There's a link to archived webinars.
Yeah.
You can find them in there.
Thank you, Melanie. So as we're wrapping up our time today, Jamie, I am wondering what you think the most important thing or things that our churches, particularly our progressive churches, our ELCA, our UCC, our UU churches, well-meaning folks, some who have a ton of lived experience and some who just are allies at heart, you know, what are the most important things that they need to know, that we need to know to support our trans and non-binary kids, our youth, our adults, the families, and to help people who have extended family members who are also living with those identities. What are the most important things that we can do, and how can we show up as people of faith?
Yeah, people of faith have done and continue to do the most significant harm to this community, personally and politically. And so that's like a hard truth, but we have to say that because that's where we get kind of the responsibility of people of faith to do repair and to work actively and to be boldly, loudly, and joyfully celebratory of this community. and advocate for justice for them and equity and inclusion. And so that means bold, loud, and joyful is the kind of the three words that I love to use. And it's the opposite of silence. You know, silence is complicity. And so we cannot sit around and just say, oh, I'm not that kind of Christian, or I'm not that kind of person of faith. I don't go to a church like that. We have to actively and boldly and loudly do the work to be otherwise. I say in the book at some point that I want parents to know that they don't have to choose between their faith and their child, but they might have to choose between their church and their child. And so be the kind of church that is putting out clear messages that says you don't have to choose between your faith and your child, that there is a space for you here. And so that means articulating regularly not only a welcome of all people, but a specific and explicit welcome of trans and non-binary people and gender diverse people, and looking for the spots where we are unintentionally stuck in the lessons that we've learned in the binaries and in the expectations. You know, I eat, sleep, and breathe this work, and still sometimes I will say something or do something or have a thought where I go, oh, wow, like that came from back there somewhere, because this has been the air we've been breathing our entire lives. And so being willing to continually self-examine and root out those old ideas that are working up in ourselves, and being willing to get it wrong. All too often, we don't speak up or move forward or do anything because we don't want to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing. And that prevents us from showing up as people of faith, as good people in community with one another. And so being willing to make a mistake when you're corrected or someone tells you you've done harm, it's okay. Take a deep breath. You are not a bad person. You made a mistake and you have an opportunity to learn. And when you learn, then you can do better. And so I think really getting comfortable with the fact that we're going to get things wrong and we're going to make mistakes, and that when someone corrects us, it's a gift. It does not mean we're bad people. And I think we really have to get kind of comfortable in our body and pay attention to that visceral body somatic reaction we have to notice that. And model that for our communities and for young people, because I think that's how change is possible. When we can move past those first reactions and even those second reactions and take in new information and internalize it, and then adjust our communities accordingly. So advocate, be public. I'm sorry, I know I'm saying all the things, but there's so much I want you to do. Get involved, pay attention to what's going on policy-wise in your communities. People are showing up as people of faith against this community and advocating against their rights. We need people of faith to come and say, I am here not in spite of my faith, but because of my faith. That's critical. And educate. So often people are just misinformed. And as we move things from issues to human beings, that's where change is possible. So connecting to real life human beings, listening to stories, and continuing to learn. That's my very long spiel.
I love everything that you said. I will share in the UU history, we have had sort of a practice of not being missionaries for UUism. And so I recently taught a class on how to preach, and one of the students did a fabulous job talking about UU evangelicism. And he talked about, because I am a UU, I am opposing this, this racist thing, or because I'm a UU, I am standing up to the school board today. So to claim our faith when we are standing for justice and opposing inequality, I think is really important. But regardless of what our faith is, because we know that the evangelicals are up there saying, God told me to do this because I'm a Christian. And, okay, well, whatever our faith is, we can say, because I hold this faith tradition, I am standing up for trans rights. Nothing wrong with that kind of evangelism.
I just would be remiss if I didn't just mention, as we are closing out today, that I'm in Cleveland, Ohio today, and I'm here because Cleveland Pride was this weekend, and our team in the national setting launched a huge campaign this weekend. It's called Love is Louder. And if you go to ucc.org/love-is-louder, you can read more about it. There's t-shirts you can buy that are going to a fund to support local churches who want to provide support for LGBTQ and particularly trans and non-binary folks right now. But we had over 200 people show up for the Cleveland Pride Parade that were UCC affiliated, marching together, over 16 churches, and then a Pride service. And at the Pride service, what one of our local pastors said was, so Cleveland was easy. What we need you to do now is to show up in those small towns that are having Pride celebrations. Show up there as people of faith. Show up there as your voice. Show up there with your "This Queer Pastor Loves You" t-shirts. You know, like those are the places where we need to stand up and be louder. You talk about that, right? And love is louder, and to be brave and to be uncomfortable, right? And to show up in people, in our people of faith, like because of our faith, not in spite of our faith.
Yeah.
Okay, I could preach and keep going, but
Thank you,
so
Jamie,
much
for joining us. I'd like to thank everybody who is listening to this webinar or who will watch it in perpetuity. It was our pleasure to have Jamie here, and Raising Kids Beyond the Binary, the subtitle.
Your copy today, dog ear the heck out of it, share it.
Celebrating God's.
Know.
Yeah, so it's the subtitle is Celebrating God's Transgender and Gender Diverse Children. So thank you very much, Jamie, for being our guest today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.